carbohydrates? Well, I want you to basically understand is the differences between complex carbohydrate and simple sugars and where you fit in within that. And if you change just a few simple things, how that's also going to help you to lose weight and live longer. So guys, the last macronutrient that we want to look at is carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is definitely one of the macronutrients that gets a lot of press. It gets a lot of good press and it gets a lot of bad press. In recent years, a lot of carbohydrate press has been around diets such as the keto diet and things of that nature. And they're basically saying, oh, you know, all processed sugars are really bad for you and this, that, and the other. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. But what I would say is that people kind of start to miss the point. When you're looking at sugar on its own, is sugar bad for you? In high quantities, anything is bad for you. If I gave someone a diet which was made of just fruit, then they would most likely put on quite a lot of weight, because the fructose, which is found in fruit, will start to amount and start to get stored as body fat, okay? So do I feel that sugar is bad for you? In small portions, no. It's probably more likely to be a part of your diet than it's not. What is bad for you is when you eat highly processed foods, such as when you go to buy a packet of something or a bag of something. They're gonna have more highly refined sugars, those processed foods, and they're also gonna have more highly refined oils, such as vegetable oil. And they're the things that are going to amount to a portion of food that when consumed, you're having more calories than you actually need. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take something as simple as a chocolate bar. A chocolate bar is going to be a highly condensed amount of sugar and fat in one item of food. And so when it's consumed, you're consuming huge amounts of sugar, huge amounts of fat, and probably processed fat, and you're also having a high amount of calories. And that's the thing. When you're having something of that nature, it's not very satisfying. So the likelihood of you wanting to have more, especially since you've had sugar, the likelihood of you wanting to have more is going to be much, much higher. And therefore, you're going to start to eat more and consume more. And because sugar is something which can become addictive, it basically means that you're going to start to look for things that are sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. And so therefore, you're going to start to choose foods that have got this very condensed amount of calories, which have got high amounts of processed sugar, high amounts of processed fat. And again, that's going to add to the overall calorie intake per day. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that when you're consuming these types of foods, you're over consuming on your calorie needs per day. And that is what's going to make you fat. The other thing we need to understand about carbohydrates is that whether your carbohydrate is coming from a bag of sweets or it's coming from a vegetable, they all go to make the same thing. So your body converts all sugars or carbohydrates into glycogen, okay? And the glycogen is stored within the muscle tissue. But once the stores are full, and that is going to then get converted into either visceral or subcutaneous fat, depending on the overall weight of the individual. So when we're looking at how we store glycogen, there is stored in two places. It's stored in muscle tissue and it's stored in the liver. And they go to say that roughly the average human can store around about 200 grams of glycogen at any given time. Okay, so when you go to the gym and you exercise hard and you run on the treadmill and you go on the rowing machine, you have a really good workout. Yes, you've depleted your glycogen stores. But as soon as you eat anything which is a carbohydrate, you're going to basically resupply the glycogen in the stores. So you're going to fill them back up again. So because we know that the body stores glycogen in the muscle and in the liver, we basically then need to start thinking about how we're going to consume our carbohydrate. So when we're looking at processed foods, such as a chocolate bar, which has got huge amounts of carbohydrate or sugar in it, not only is it easy to digest and process, which means it's going to send your insulin sky high, it also is going to mean that it's more likely to get stored as fat because your body's trying to do something with it. And if you've got your glycogen stores within your muscle tissue and then within your liver, at the max capacity, that basically then is going to then go into overflow, which basically means that energy gets stored as fat. So what we need to start to consider, how are we going to get the carbohydrate that we need per day to be able to be functional and feel okay, but also not overconsume on the amount we need. So if your body is a vessel that can store up to 200 grams worth of glycogen, which comes from the carbohydrate food that you eat, whether that's from a bag of sweets or from fruit and vegetables, how do we lose body fat? Well, your body also uses a different form of energy called a ketogen. And ketogen, or ketosis, comes from the breakdown of fat tissue via function of the liver back into the body and gets used when glycogen isn't as present. Now, when you're having a very normal day-to-day diet and a day-to-day routine, there are always going to be ketogens within the blood. But when the body starts to run out of glycogen stores or glycogen isn't as present, the body will start to call upon body fat to use as energy. And that basically means that the body wants to create more ketogens to keep the body running. Now, there have been plenty of studies to show that an individual can actually live off its own ketogens as long as the calorie intake matches the requirements that is needed per day. What that basically means is, in layman terms, that you as an individual can actually eat a lower amount of carbohydrates as long as you make sure that you're having a higher fat and protein intake per day to be able to substitute the lack of carbohydrates in the body. What that's going to then do is then that's going to start to call upon the amount of body fat to be turned into ketogens, and slowly over time you're going to start to notice that you're going to lose extra weight because your body is using that energy, because the amount of carbohydrate that you used to consume isn't the same as what it used to be. So what would I recommend? I recommend for most people to consume anywhere between 80 to 120 grams of carbohydrate per day. Now, again, if you go back onto an app, a tracking app such as MyFitnessPal, and you do a day's worth of tracking, I probably would think that most people's carbohydrate intake is much, much higher than that. So let's say for a second that you're an individual who consumes roughly about 200 grams of carbohydrate per day, and I'm asking you to get it down all the way to 120 grams per day. It's going to be a little bit difficult. So what I suggest you do is you start to slowly but surely drop off the amount of carbohydrate that you don't need in your diet and start to replace it with healthier forms of fat and healthier forms of protein, and start to look at how you're going to change your eating habits within your lifestyle. And that's basically how you're going to successfully lose weight over a long period of time. So you might have heard of someone talk about complex carbohydrates and simple carbohydrates. What's the difference? Really, really easy. The complex carbohydrates are basically natural forms of carbohydrate. So when you're looking at fruit, when you're looking at a vegetable, or if you're looking at something like grains or beans or lentils, anything like that, they mainly tend to be natural forms of carbohydrate. They have fiber in them and they have possibly some fat in them as well. And they'll also have some natural forms of protein in them. And that basically means that they're more complicated, or they're more complex for the body to break down. So it takes much, much longer for the body to be able to obtain the amount of carbohydrate or glycogen within those types of foods. When you're looking at simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, you're looking at things that doesn't take a lot for the body to be able to break down. So a bag of sweets is a really good example. A chocolate bar, a bag of crisps, a donut, a pizza, the list goes on and on. Anything that's been refined and reduced is much, much easier for the body to break down. Therefore, it doesn't have to work as hard. But when we're looking at processed foods, they often don't have much quality to them. And what do I mean by that? Well, there isn't that much vitamins in them. There isn't many minerals in them. And there's also huge amounts of fat and huge amounts of sugar. And basically what that means is that there is a vast amount of calories within a small product, such as something like a snack like a chocolate bar or a bag of crisps. So what we want to do is start to get rid of that processed food, because there's no quality in it, and we want to start to be able to find our more complex carbohydrates, from more natural sources of food. And again, just by doing that, even if you do it by 10 or 20% within your overall diet, you will over time start to see your body weight come down, because your body will start to work harder in trying to find that carbohydrate rather than being giving it instantaneously in something as simple as a sweet treat or just refined food. So the takeaway message for carbohydrate, guys, is that you need to check the amount of processed food that you eat and lower that. You also need to look at the amount of fruit and vegetables that you consume and possibly up them, but you probably want to look at things such as vegetables more, because they actually have less carbohydrate in them than they do fruit, because fruit tends to hold quite a lot of fructose. But we're not going to cut fruit out of the equation as such. What we also want to do is we want to look at having more protein and more fat, which will allow the body to burn more body fat, turn it back into a ketogen, and allow that to be used as a form of energy rather than constantly having to use glycogen.
It's the Yo Party Week.